Okay, so let me start the introduction. So here we go. The Shiraz University Digital Humanities Student Association is hosting this meeting. Dr. Lear Shamir, with his extensive experience and expertise in data science across various disciplines, has graciously accepted our invitation to join us today, and we are honored to have him here. I'm Mehrzad Barzagar, the head of the Digital Humanities Student Association of Shiraz University, and also the moderator of this event. I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed guest here, Dr. Lear Shamir. Before Dr. Shamir embarked on his remarkable journey in the field of data science, he pursued his academic endeavors at Tel Aviv University, Open University, and Michigan Technological University, followed by postdoctoral work at National Institute on Aging of the International Institute of Health, NIH. With over 8 years of experience in the software and technology industry, Dr. Shamir has made significant contributions to research, particularly in the application of data science methodologies to various disciplines, including astronomy, biology, medicine, humanities, psychology, and more. His dedication to advancing inclusion in higher education further exemplifies his commitment to empowering underrepresented populations in STEM and humanities. Dr. Shamir's impressive academic achievements, including being the primary author of nearly 100 peer-reviewed publications, securing over $5 million in external funding, and serving as a reviewer for over 50 journals, underscore his profound impact. The title of today's webinar is Quantitative and Data-Driven Approaches to Stylometrics. The session will last about an hour and 15 minutes, with an hour dedicated to Dr. Shamir's presentation and the remaining time for interactive Q&A session. With further ado, I invite Dr. Shamir to share his insights and expertise with us today. The virtual stage is yours, Dr. Shamir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be with you. And especially when the audience is coming from the background of digital humanities. These are one of the things that fascinate me the most, the digital humanities. One of the reasons is because I really like the humanities, and my problem is that I don't have the sufficient talent to do anything or to create anything that is humanities. So I still enjoy the humanities, the great human creations, by analyzing it mathematically, analyzing it through numbers. That's the language that I can speak. So that's the approach that I took to address the humanities. And that's how even people like me, can enjoy the humanities. I'm going to show you a little bit how that is done, and I'm going to throw a lot of information on you in the next 45 minutes or so. So let's see. So we'll start with, what do you mean by style? Because style is something that is kind of vaguely defined. I think here's the literature definition. A distinctive appearance typically determined by the principle according to which something is designed. And that is a definition that is difficult to come up with an equation, difficult to convert that into an equation. It's not straightforward. It's not something trivial that you immediately can turn into something quantitative. So what do we do here? So that's how we approach it. So we take the content and we break the content into quantitative elements, a large number of quantitative elements, regardless what the content is. The content can be, let's say, a great novel. It can be a great painting. It can be a great music creation. It can be anything. Where we break it into a bunch of quantitative elements, things like numbers that somehow describe the content in a certain way. And then with those quantitative elements, we can apply multivariative analysis, typically machine learning, and then we can come up with the results of that. So that's basically the process from like a bird's eye view of the process. And I like to start with a deep neural network because that is something that has been talked a lot with analyzing of either text or visual content like art and so on. So, and that is something that's a concept that's a little bit tricky for digital humanities because, well, the advantage of deep neural network is basically, first of all, it's accessible. So any person, you don't need to have an advanced degree in signal processing to run really impressive machine learning tasks. With deep neural network, just download the code, copy and paste it and run it. And high school kids very often do that. So that really made it much more accessible. The main the other advantage of deep neural network is that it's flexible in its learning capacity. So while machine learning model reach its limited capacity, there's a certain thing that they can learn and they cannot learn anymore. Then with deep neural network, we can always add more more layers to our network, and then it learns more. So that made deep neural network very popular. Also in the digital humanities, they've been used. But there's one major downside to deep neural network when applied to the digital humanities. And that is because deep neural network work as a black box. And there's a whole field of explainable AI, if you're familiar with the term, a field that aims at explaining how those deep neural network works. But it's not necessarily explainable, and the tools, explainable AI tools that are used are themselves not explainable. So the deep neural network is giving us something, but it doesn't tell us how or why and what it does. And that makes it very difficult when you're humanist, when you try to investigate or research how things were done or what makes things different or similar to others. Relying on the black box deep neural networks makes it difficult. So we do it a little bit differently here. We do it in a way that's explainable and we can understand. And I'm going to start with visual art. Visual art is part of the humanities art. And it's something I personally like very much. I really enjoy looking at art. Even though I cannot fully understand, I still enjoy looking, observing it. And to analyze art, what we need is, it needs to be some computer vision, that the computer needs to understand something from the art, and the computer needs to see something. It needs to be comprehensive, because art is not about specific thing. The art is about the whole painting, not one specific element in the painting that we can focus on. That might be like our typical vision when we, let's say, when we walk across a room, then we're focusing on specific things. That's not the case with art. That's what makes art so special. So it needs to be comprehensive, but it needs to be also explainable and intuitive, so we can not just throw some algorithms on something and call it results. We need to understand what we're seeing. Sorry. So this is in very short how it's done. There are about 2 textbooks of computer vision here in this slide, so I want to run it over it very quickly. If you're curious, you can look it up in these papers that I specified there. But basically, each painting is broken into about 2,800 numbers that describe the painting. They describe like the texture or the distribution of colors or the statistical analysis of the paintings, the fractals of the paintings, the edges, how edges are used, and the edges are sharp or not sharp, and so on. So, and it comes down to 2,800 numbers, indicators that describe each painting. And then after we apply that, we can use machine learning. And then something that I like a lot in digital humanities is hierarchical clustering. I'm going to show you some examples of that. So here's an example of hierarchical clustering. So what we see here, that's the dendrogram, a phylogeny. It's called a phylogeny. And each node in this phylogeny, in this graph, is a painting represented by 35 paintings. So each painter is represented by just the painting. So the algorithm doesn't know anything about the painters other than the painting, other than the visual content that they create. And you apply the algorithm, and then you apply the hierarchical clustering, and that's the output of the algorithm. That's what the computer is giving you. And you can see here that the computer knew to separate the classical realist painter. They're all in the bottom part of the graph. In the upper part of the graph, there's the more modern painters. But even those are subdivided into categories. So if you look at the classical realist, you see on the left side, this is the early Renaissance. And then when you move a little bit to the right, the yellow painters, these are the high Renaissance painters. And the blue, these are the Northern Renaissance painters. And then you come Mannerism and Baroque and Rococo. And so that is pretty much like a art historian would have arranged that graph. Also the upper graph. the upper side of the graph. They're really clustered or subclustered by their school of art or by the artistic genres. So that was an early example. That was back in 2012. So that was over a decade ago, showing that computers can understand to some level art in the way that an art historian would understand it. Well, obviously with the limitation, but it comes to the same conclusion. And at that time, there was a big news at the time. It was all over the news that computers can do that thing. Again, it was over a decade ago, so that's today it's no news, but at the time that was um, a big news then. But the question is, okay, it's nice that computer that can do that, but what can we discover in the humanities? What discoveries in the humanities? What insight in the humanities can we get from that? And here's an example. So what we saw here, when you look at also in this graph, you can see that Van Gogh and Pollock, for some reason, Van Gogh is not clustered with Cézanne or Gauguin or Monet, like artist Van Gogh was most associated with, but it's closer to Jackson Pollock, and that was very consistent. And we looked into that, and here's a comparison between Jackson Pollock and Van Gogh, Monet, and Renoir. And we can see that Van Gogh, when we just compare the numerical content descriptor, the numerical descriptor of the paintings, Van Gogh is much, much closer to Jackson Pollock compared to Monet and Renoir, much closer. And that was something very consistent that happened. And it shows that the two were inspired from each other. Some people suggested it when we saw that, then we went back and we saw that some people did suggest things like that, but it was kind of sparse. It wasn't really based on something that can be proven. And here it's something that helps us to show that mathematically. And that also led to understanding Jackson Pollock mathematical setting. So if you know Jackson Pollock, he's famous for his drip painting, abstract expressionist, so he doesn't necessarily paint shapes that we can immediately identify. His painting are more about delivering an emotion or an expression. And his style is different than other people's style who try to mimic that, and that's what we try to see. And we saw that, yeah, Jackson Pollock has a different style than artists that try to mimic Jackson Pollock. So that's basically the basic results of that. But soon I'll get to the details of what makes that different. And yeah, so after we did that, and that was so Jackson Pollock, many people are interested in Jackson Pollock, and that was all over the news. That the computer can identify between Jackson Pollock's painting and paintings that were not made by Jackson Pollock. So that was over. And then we started to receive a lot of paintings, but people who claim that they have a Jackson Pollock painting, an authentic Jackson Pollock painting, and they want us to verify that, obviously, because a Jackson Pollock painting worth at least $100 million. So that's an incentive for people to do these things. But so we received hundreds of those. Now, obviously, these are not original Jackson Pollock's painting. There's no way there are hundreds original, authentic Pollocks out there in some people's ethics and so on. Almost all of them, if not all of them, are not authentic Jackson Pollocks, and that allows us to make a comparison between those who try to fake a Jackson Pollock painting and a real Jackson Pollock. And what you see here, that's the fractality. So what makes Jackson Pollock special compared to people who try to mimic his work is the fractality of his work. The fractals are organized differently compared to people who worked really hard to try to mimic that and create a painting that would seem to an unsuspecting person as if Jackson Pollock made them. So that's, again, one thing that we could discover with that. And here's another thing that we discovered here, that what we did here was to test if abstract expressionism, what makes it art. Because, so abstract expressionism, some people even say it's a hoax. It's not just like something that anyone can do. So what we did here is a psychology experiment. So we used a lot of paintings that are abstract expressionist pattern, and we compared them to paintings that were made by animals and by little children. And when you just look at them, because they use the same drawing materials, they might look like it's difficult to identify between them, but apparently people can identify between them. We did an experiment with the Amazon Mechanical Turk, asking people to identify them, and people were able to tell whether, after quick training, people were able to tell if the painting was created by an artist or by a child or an animal. And not to 100%, but to certainly better than random. And again, we saw when we looked at the features, at what makes people know, tell between an artist and a child, is the fractal. You can see here that the fractal gives the far stronger signal than anything else. It's the eye of the painter works in a way that is reflected by the fractal. So that's something that we could discover with that, some new knowledge, new insight that we could have done with that. Now I'll move very quickly to music, how we can analyze music. And we can do things in a fairly similar way, but instead of music features, instead of numbers that describe visual content, we can use values that describe audio content or music, and then use machine learning for that. Here's an example. So we took, that's a graph of, again, it was generated automatically by the computer, except for the images, the photos of the artist, but the graph itself was created automatically. Each node is made of songs, and the computer needs to organize the song in the way that makes the most sense by how close or how similar they are to each other. And you can see that it's really organized by genres. So let's say you can see that Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis, the jazz musicians, are clustered together, and Bob Marley and Jimmy Cliff and Todd and the Maples are all reggae musicians, and you can see they're all clustered together. So it clusters all of that as pretty close to how a human would have clustered them. Again, it doesn't really make a discovery. It just shows that the computer can mimic the work of a person, but it can be used for discoveries. Let's see. So let's see this thing. So that these are the same thing, but each node here of the graph is an album of the Beatles. Most of you are probably young and you never lived during the time of the Beatles. I haven't lived that time myself. But we still know the music. We still know the music. It's still meaningful for many people. And what we did here, we asked the computer to organize the albums of the Beatles by how they sound, by their sound, how similar the sound is. So the computer doesn't know anything about the albums other than the songs that are in each album, other than the audio data. And here, what the graph that you see here, that's how it's organized by the computer. And you can see it's pretty interesting that it's organized in a chronological order, and that's something that when you listen to the music of the Beatles, you can feel it, you can sense it, but it's hard to prove it. It's hard to prove it because, it's something that you hear, and how do you put it into a formal proof? And here with the numbers, and we can prove it. And also interesting thing, like Abbey Road is you can see that the bottom of the graph, it's the 1969, and the algorithm flipped the order, but that's actually a correct thing because the album Let It Be was recorded before Abbey Road. It was released after, but it was recorded before. So musically, it is before the last album, Abbey Road. And we can see that the biggest gap is between 1964 and 1965. 1965, that where they changed the musical style. You may be able to hear it also, but it's difficult to a little difficult to identify, but definitely difficult or almost impossible to prove it. So we can do it here. I was again, the Beatles attracts a lot of attention. There was a lot of interest in that at that time, in that thing that the computer can understand Beatles song, and we did it for many other bands. I'm going to go over it very quickly because it's really repetitive, but the algorithm was able to identify the musical style either in chronological order, or here in the case of Queen, that you have like the branch on the right side, where the Queen went from the 1970s rock to the 1980s pop music and changed their style. It's ABBA, very much in chronological order. U2, we did several classic band. Bee Gees was more complex because the band has been around for a very long time and changed the musical styles multiple times. So it gets something like this. And here's something interesting that what can we do with it? Another thing we can do with it at the time, I don't know if you remember, it was the Winter Olympics. There was the song, the theme song of the Winter Olympics. Many people suspected that it was really very similar to the song "Let It Go" from Frozen at that time. And Frozen, the movie, and the movie and the song "Let It Go," the theme song, were very popular at that time. Not anymore. They don't play them on the radio or something like that anymore. But at the time, it was like they played it all the time. If you remember that. And people suspected that it sounded the same, and they asked us to do that. So that's the Foreign Policy magazine, and they asked us to look into that. And here's the analysis. So you can see in the purple circle that "Let It Go" and the Olympic song were very close to each other. They're not surprisingly, they really sound very, very close to each other. And all the other nodes are all kind of other songs. They're like Disney songs, and like those green are the blue are Disney songs. And so that's something that can be done with that, although it's pretty rare use of that. Let's see here. So now I'm going to go to style of text. And that's something that I'm still working on fairly intensively. There are many uses to that. And I was going to start with sentiment analysis, and that was a little bit older from 2019, so it's not completely new. But what we did here was something really simple. What we did is just applying Tone Analyzer, which is a tool that is now purchased by IBM. It started as an academic tool. IBM purchased it. And we applied it to the Billboard Top 100 songs from starting in the 1950s to the 2000s. Billboard is a magazine that ranks songs by their popularity. They have different ways to rank songs by the popularity, and historically, we know which song was number one and for how many weeks and so on. So, and that all comes from Billboard magazine. So for each year, so we took from each year the top 100 songs as songs that represent the taste or the preference of people during that year. And we applied the tone analyzer, the 11 tones, to see how it changed over time. And let's see what we had. And these are some examples of the analysis. So that is the analysis of anger and joy. And we can see, for instance, that joy is getting, in general, joy is getting lower. So songs are become less joyful and become more angry. You can see on the left, they become more angry over time. It's not completely linear. There are obviously fluctuations, as you can see, but music becomes angrier. But also during the time, we can see different periods and different expressions of anger and also joy. You can see it like in the first half of the 1950s. You can see that there were not a lot of anger there. At that time, music was used for entertainment, for fun, for dancing, for all that. Music didn't have a social role at that time. That started during the 1960s, or the second half of the 1960s, that music started to become as a tool for social activism, for expressing, for protesting against different things, or wanting to change society. And that expressed more anger, and you can see the increase there. And we can see the increase over time. We can see also a different period, like after the 1990s and things like that, and definitely in the 2000s. So it wasn't linear. Music does respond to event that happens. And again, that was done quantitatively. You can listen to the song and maybe rank them or things like that, but really it takes a lot of time. And it's also subjective, because anger is something subjective. And when you listen to a song and you want to analyze how angry the song is, so it's subjective, and each person might understand the song differently. Here we formalize that. It was also, there was a lot of interest in that at that time, and led us to do some more work, for instance, understanding how different artists or musicians, basically, or songwriters, are different from each other. And here's an example of readability index, how complex the lyrics are. And you can see different bands like Traffic or the Grateful Dead. They use complex lyrics. Their lyrics are meant for an, let's say, older or more sophisticated audience. On the other side of the scale, you have like U2 or Neil Young that choose to use a simpler form. So, but definitely there are differences between them. Not every songwriter, the readability index or the difficulty to read the song is the same. Not at all. They're different, and each one has a different style. Also in positivity, for sure, I see George Harrison and Eric Clapton, The Doors, very positive, and they tend to express a lot of positivity in their lyrics. And others, like Billy Joel, for instance, that's an interesting one that is not very positive. Billy Joel, if you know the musician, is struggling for many years with depression. Since a very young age, is struggling with depression. And that might reflect with his lyrics. Deep Purple is like a heavy metal band, and heavy metal are known for less positive lyrics, and so on. Pink Floyd, Journey, a rock band, Dr. Dre, a rapper, it's also like that. So they're really different in their positivity, and you can see it. Yeah. That leads us to literature style. So here, we're not using just the sentiments. Here, we're trying to do a comprehensive analysis of the literature. And for that, we analyze here, you can see a list, that's a partial list, basically, of elements of the text that we analyze in concert. So we extract all of these elements from the text, and we analyze them in context. And it's a tool called UDET. It's a tool that it's open source. So we released the tool. It's an open source. Anyone can use it. You don't need to be a computer programmer to use it. You can just apply it to your data and use it. And one of its advantages, it will work. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it will also work in any any language. So it's not all of it is language dependent. But it's a tool. It's an open source tool. You can apply it to a text file and of any literature of your choice, and it will analyze. It will do the analysis very easily, so you don't need to code all these textbooks of algorithms. And you can see that it analyzes a lot of things: the use of punctuation, use of uppercase, the distribution of parts of speech or patterns of part of speech, the distribution of word length or sentence length or things like that. So each one measures something fairly simple about the text. Not all of them are simple, but many of them are simple. But when you combine them and when you use all of them in concert, you might be able to get good information about the text. And that's what we apply here. So that's a relatively recent paper that you can see. But again, the code is open. You can just get the code on the compiled version for Windows and do it. Here's a very simple example. When you apply to hotel review styles, and you apply to a hotel review style, you create that graph. That UDET also creates that graph. And it comes automatically from the analysis. And what we can see is that people write hotel reviews, and the style that they write is different based on the continent or country they're in. For instance, you can see that the American hotels are all in the top left part of this graph. And then you have London and Montreal, and then you have the Asian on the right side. So it really shows that when people write a review for a hotel, they kind of adjust their style to an existing style, to a conforming style, or whatever leads to that. But it's pretty clear that the styles are matching. But that is something that is not just hotel reviews. It's not something, not the primary human creation. We can see also what makes the reviews different or similar from each other. Here you can see the differences. So diversity of words. In China hotel reviews, the diversity of words is the words that they select are much more diverse, we can see here, than American hotels. American hotel, reviewers tend to be more repetitive in the words they use. Also in Chinese hotel, there's even longer words. Why? That's an interesting question. Why? But we can see it mathematically, or more questions. That we can see very easily. That when reviewers of Chinese hotels or hotels in China, they ask more questions than those who review hotels in the United States, and so on. So if that can be used for reviews of hotels, we can also use it for literature, which is more interesting. And here, that's a very basic example. We can see here that each node here is a book taken from the Gutenberg project. So you can go there, and there's an open source books. All the classics are there in text format. So we can download it from there, and we can apply it. And you can see that the computer was able to identify books by their style. So all the Shakespeare books, for instance, are clustered together. The computer knew that these are the same style and differentiated them from a Crane or Doctor or other painters or other authors. So there is something in the style, and that makes sense. I mean, if you read a book, if an expert reads a book, even if they don't know it's Shakespeare, they might be able to recognize the style. But that can help us to break down the Shakespeare style, and that's also fairly recent. It's from last year. And what we see here, we try to do a regression, a multivariative regression, that we use all those elements that we extract from each of Shakespeare plays, of Shakespeare books, and try to make a regression and predict the year it was written in just based on those elements. And so what we can see is the Shakespeare style changed over time. We can definitely see that. You can see the linear regression shows a graph. So Shakespeare style changed over time. And we can also see some books that were ahead of them, like precursor books. So you can see like Romeo and Juliet, for instance, and around the top left part of the graph, you can see that it was written around 1596. That's the year attributed to it. We don't know the exact year. These are all by expert analysis or historians. We don't know exactly when each play was written, but that's the estimate. And we can see that its style is much more similar to books written in 1610, about 15 years later. So, and we see several other books like that. So we can see that the style changes, and we can also see that we have precursor books there. Let's see what changed. So we can see here sentence length, for instance. So Shakespeare started with writing long sentences and gradually moved to using shorter sentences. That's something very, very trivial, very easy to say when you see it, but when you just read in Shakespeare play, it's very difficult to notice that just by reading it. So by applying a computational tool, it becomes much easier to see these things. They're very difficult to see manually. Sentiments also, we can see that the negative sentiment dropped and the positive sentiment increased. So Shakespeare has become more positive over time. His first play were kind of more tragic, when he did have more tragedies in his first years compared to more comedy in his most recent years. Use of pronouns also increased. You can see a statistically significant increase in the use of pronouns. Shakespeare used more pronouns in his later work compared to his early work. And here's an analysis of Romeo and Juliet. So we did notice that several books were precursor books, had style that fit much later years. Romeo and Juliet was one of them, and then we can see what makes them similar to later years books. And here we can see, for instance, the word homogeneity. And we can see that Romeo and Juliet, the word homogeneity is closer to the later work than to Shakespeare's early work. Same thing with the summer frequency, for instance, or words related to weather, for instance. So word related to weather much closer in Romeo and Juliet to the to Shakespeare late work, and different from Shakespeare early work. Also the sentiment, we can see it. So there are several things, like the bottom line sentiment. You see that the sentiment expressed in Romeo and Juliet is more typical. The way the sentiment is distributed as expressed in the book is more similar to more recent years than to early years of Shakespeare. So it allows us not just to see that there are some plays or some books that are ahead of their time. It shows us which one, what makes them that way. Moving to same technology, you can apply to political speeches. It's like we used more than 1 million speeches over 138 years. And that's the advantage of using computers for that, because if you want to analyze 1 million speeches manually, it's not going to be possible. It's not practical. So in 130 years, yeah, we get it from the Congress archive, so that's easy. But reading 1 million speeches and analyzing them manually, it's not practical. So we apply a computer, and computer can do it in a few days. And that's what we see here. So here's a very simple experiment. Use of energy words, and we can see that people in Congress, that's the American Congress. So people in the American Congress used energy in the use of energy words or words related to energy increases over time. And what I like is that we can see the peak at around in the first half of the 1970s. That's where the energy crisis, the world energy crisis, happened. And we can see, so that's kind of a control experiment. It doesn't tell us anything that we didn't know, but it's a control experiment. Let's look at other things that maybe are more surprising. So that is the use of terms related to women and terms related to men. So we can see here that the terms related to men are used less frequently over time in Congress speeches, while terms used in women has been relatively low until around the 1980s, where it started to increase, and it increased sharply. And now in Congress, terms related to women are used much more often than they used to, still not as high as the terms related to men, but you see that it's getting it's getting higher, it's increasing. Again, pretty difficult to see when you just read the speeches. Answer readability index, so that's how complex the language is. And we see that that's interesting, because until the early 1970s, the speeches, congressional speeches has been becoming increasingly more complex to read or to understand, use longer words, longer sentences, and so on. But starting in 1970s, it started to decrease, and we see a very sharp turn here, a very clear turn here. Both parties, it's where in the United States system, there are basically two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. We can see the two parties there. The Republicans are red, the Democrats are blue. We can see in both parties that happened. And it can be associated with the presence of media, because until before the 1970s, Congress speeches were rarely broadcasted through the media. And during the 1970s, media started to become much more involved, and we suspect that politicians adjusted their speeches to the media to make it more accessible, to make their speeches more accessible to a broader audience, not necessarily the people in the venue, in the building, listening to them at that time. And we can see it around the 2000, there was kind of a split where the Republican continued to lower the readability index, while Democratic speeches started to increase readability index. So again, these are things very difficult to see when you just read in the speeches. And the sentiments, what we see here basically is both negative and positive sentiments are increasing all the time. Again, responding to different situations, like you can see, like in the early 1960s, that a lot of positivities that really reflected the time during the United States, during the 1960s, were like the golden years in the United States, reflected in the political speeches. But what we can see basically is that politicians tend to use more emotion, they express more sentiments in the speeches over time. It's still increasing. And very briefly, that's how we apply it to the scientific literature to see the differences between different disciplines. Scientists um, express themselves differently, and we compare 4 different disciplines: computer science, astrophysics, mathematics, and physics, to see how different it is. And here's one example of the self-references, how self-reference words are being used, like I, we, our, and so on. And you can definitely see differences between discipline and computer sciences. The lowest number of self-references. Mathematics apparently tend to refer to themselves far more often than in computer science. There could be multiple reasons to that. And here's my last thing that I want to show you is how style can be used here, in this case, to identify phishing emails. So phishing emails, is an attack where someone sends you an email and the email pretends that from someone from a credible source asking you for some information, maybe your password, maybe your other information, maybe sometimes they ask you to give them money or something like that, and it's a scam. They just pretend to be a credible source. It's a scam, but it's a scam that works. Unfortunately, it works pretty well on many people, and it causes a lot of billions of dollars in damage every year. So what we try to do here is to defend from an AI-generated phishing emails, because the problem with the AI is that it can generate emails and each person gets a different email that sounds convincing, like a person wrote it, but because each email is different, then the spam detection will not be able to recognize, because each email is different. It's not the same email, so it's not exactly detected as spam. And that's something pretty recent. That's from this month. So what we did, we used the style analysis that we did to identify between a spam email, not a spam, a phishing email written by a person, also spam, but our goal was phishing email written by a person, and a phishing email written by AI. And we could see that with that analysis, the computer is able to identify whether the email was written by a person or AI, and then with that information, we'll be able to defend against such email scams. So that's how those stylistic analysis can be used, not just for understanding art or literature or human creation. It can also, there are also practical uses to it that we can use in practice. So that will be all I have to say about style today. Well, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your thorough explanation, Jamir. That was great. It shed light on different aspects where, like, the data-driven approaches to the Stylometrics can be applied. For example, I don't know that you did so much great things with art, especially visual art. And my question was that, how do you select the features to look for when you are, let's say, designing your model? Do you do you take advice from a person who is, for example, an art historian, when you're looking for, let's say, where to look for, like the brush strokes or colors or such? Or is it just, let's say, I don't know, like applied by, used by the machine learning algorithm itself?
That's a fantastic question. It's very important. So the idea was, in fact, not to use artists' opinions or not to use specific things like paintbrushes. Right, there's a lot of work on analyzing brush strokes in paintings to identify them. Our approach was deliberately and by design not to use that, but let the computer choose mathematically the features. So we applied 2,800 features. It's a large number of descriptors of the visual content. and analyze them mathematically and let the computer choose, because otherwise the reason we did it, because otherwise we are driven by a hypothesis, and we don't want to be bound to an hypothesis. We don't want to be driven by something that will then skew and bias everything or every analysis that would follow that. So we want to be as neutral as possible, as objective as possible, and just leave it for the computer. The computer is supposed to be objective, or the algorithm that we use is objective, just to select the features mathematically, the most informative ones, and then use that are selected mathematically, but not manually. We don't want to use our own perspective or our own biases or someone else's biases, but we want to see, and that's how we want to see if the computer can mimic the classification system or the genre classification system of a person or art historians, yet without getting the opinions of art historians, just leaving it all to the computer. But that's how we approach it. But that is a fantastic question. These are the two paradigms. The other paradigm is, yes, is exactly that, to use art knowledge of artists and code that and use that as your base for your analysis. And that's not the approach that we took for the reason I just mentioned.
Great, thank you. So that would be like categorize it under the unsupervised machine learning, if I'm not mistaken.
It's
right?
Exactly right.
Great. Thank you. If anyone else have any questions, we are here. I guess participants really enjoyed it, and you explained it a lot. I mean, with the beginning was that, so I mean, doesn't tell us anything new, but then you shifted the focus toward the new findings that each, let's say, survey or research has yielded. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Apparently not. I mean, yes. Okay. Thank you very much once again for the great presentation that you had. It was very eye-opening and very comprehensive. Thank you very much, Dr. Shamir. It's great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting the invitation. It's great having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm having a good time with you. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for, why is my background like this? ممنون که تشریف آوردین همگی. روز همگی بخیر. آخر هفته خوبی داشته باشید.